Hi, welcome to the Communitarian Podcast. The aim of such a project is to explore and examine the philosophy of communitarianism, the central premise being the emphasis of the community as opposed to the individual. Unsurprisingly, such a broad philosophy can be found to be part of the subject matter of religion, science, and politics, and much more besides. Therefore, in no particular order, I will explore such ideas. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is an introduction and a first in a series of podcasts that I have produced about the thinker Peter Kropotkin. The first important point to recognise is that Peter Kropotkin, who lived between 1842 and 1921, is probably one of the most well-known anarchist thinkers of all time. I first became acquainted with him after reading a brilliant biography simply called The Anarchist Prince. Kropotkin lived a truly fascinating life, which was only enhanced by the dignified and principled way he chose to live it. However, it's not the purpose of this discussion to discuss such a biographical study. Kropotkin was a very prolific writer, and I could have called upon any one of his works in preparation for this undertaking. The sources used were the following: Anarchism, a collection of revolutionary writings. This book is made up of a number of Kropotkin's smaller essays, which I read the following: Anarchist Communism, its basic principles; Anarchist Morality; Anarchism, its philosophy and ideal; and finally, Modern Science and Anarchism. In addition, I read his book simply called Ethics. Sadly, he was unable to fully complete such a work due to ill health and eventual death. Those familiar with his work will rightly realise that such sources do not include his most famous and influential works, The Conquest of Bread or Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. Therefore, this discussion should not be considered as an exhausted exploration of his ideas. In fact, my focus is primarily around his moral philosophy. However, it is worth noting that his work, The Ethics, is really a continuation of his better-known work, Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. My overall thoughts of undertaking such a project. The first thing to say is that Kropotkin's work is very well written and accessible. There is no academic pretense, instead only his sincere desire to convince the reader of his claims. For me, this was emphasised by an eerie, succinct feeling I felt when his arguments and ideas were presented themselves to me. In aid of this, he also expenses a lot of energy documenting the historical and theoretical context of the arguments he is presenting, always tipping his hat to those thinkers deserving accolades. As already stated, I was interested in investigating Kropotkin's moral outlook. What surprised me was that Kropotkin's ideas and views around morality actually play an integral role in his wider political thought. In the process of compiling this set of discussions, I have been truly won over by Kropotkin's arguments, and now have adopted many of them into my own roster. I will now give a taster and a breakdown of the next 5 following podcasts to do with this subject matter. Part 1. Mutual Aid, Kropotkin and Darwin. Part 1 is primarily a scientific discussion. If you're not familiar with Kropotkin's work, it may come as a surprise that he's so interested in the scientific agenda and method. However, interest in mutual aid forms a key building block of much of his philosophical outlook. Mutual aid is simply a practice of cooperation, which in turn provides an evolutionary advantage to those who practice it. There is nothing scientifically controversial about such a factor and its evolutionary significance. In fact, this is why Charles Darwin relates to the discussion, since he too points out such a phenomena. However, both thinkers actually go further and argue for something else, which is just as scientific but less well known. Put simply, the practice of mutual aid, which we could term a social instinct, plays a far greater evolutionary role than those instincts of self-preservation. Personally, I did not know this. and on first appearances it appears contentious. The rest of this discussion investigates the powerful influence such social instincts have on our evolutionary development as human beings. Kropotkin does something which I am very sympathetic to, that is, an anthropological study of man's behaviours and customs. Such an investigation led Kropotkin to a fundamental premise of his moral argument. Quote, "Identification of the unit with the whole lies the origin of all ethics, the germ out of which all subsequent concepts of justice and the still higher concepts of morality evolved." This can essentially be categorized as a moral popularism. It was our anonymous ancestors who developed and maintained our social instincts, of which we so highly praise today. This is where Kropotkin and Darwin share further agreement, and out of any single individual, it is Darwin that Kropotkin praises the most for what he has contributed to moral philosophy, in particular Darwin's book, The Descent of Man. Part 2. Kropotkin asks, why don't we take such evidence seriously? Part 2 follows by asking a simple question. If our social instincts are so instrumental to our past development, then why don't they inform the way we live today? It's interesting to note that never once does Kropotkin address the philosophical is-ought problem presented by David Hume. This is the idea that just because our ancestors lived like this in the past doesn't mean we ought to live like this in the future. However, I have a hunch that Kropotkin would have argued that we have no choice, since the only alternative is to rely on superstition, transcendental or metaphysical inspiration. This at best can only provide vague answers. Most of Part 2 is dedicated to addressing the reasons why such an understanding of morality has been sidelined, under the following topics: skepticism of scientism, bad science, incompatibility with religion, incompatibility with government, inaccurate moral theories, supposed decay of morality, economic individualism. It is only when we have cleared the deck of such intellectual cul-de-sacs that we are able to fully appreciate the project at hand. Part 3. Kropotkin's alternative approach. Part 3 begins with Kropotkin's dizzying alternative to understand ethics as a science, and thereby understand its principles and the possibility of its progression. The most important step is to understand that a naturalistic explanation of our social instincts provide the necessary context and framework which informs our whole moral outlook. Put another way, our social instincts are the lens through which we see the world. Kropotkin praises the thinker Mark Gao, who apt description of such an immediate truth, and I was personally blown away after reading the following quote of his. "We are not enough for ourselves. We have more tears than our own suffering can claim, more capacity for joy than our own existence can justify." Part 4. How does this relate to anarchism? Before continuing within Part 4, it seems necessary to address the elephant in the room. How does this relate to political anarchism? There is actually a surprisingly concise explanation which links together the current line of inquiry and anarchism in general. The first reason is that anarchism is a scientific project. It uses the same inductive method as science, so if a proposition cannot be rationally justified, it should be rejected. Second reason is that anarchism is the only vessel to facilitate moral progress. Progress requires individuals to participate in a civic life free from blind obedience. This latter reason is very reminiscent of William Godwin's writings. Society should not restrict the individual's ability to cultivate their own moral capacities. In a discussion titled Religious Appeal, it is explained how Kropotkin has a nuanced position when it comes to the power of religious conviction. It is a far cry from Karl Marx's comment that it is merely the opium of the masses. Instead, Kropotkin puts forward a tantalizing idea that anarchist ideal could be put forward, which appeals to the same motives behind religious thought. Put simply, the anarchist ideal is the mass reawakening of individuals' moral sentiments and the further promotion and cultivation of moral progress. It is for this reason I would brandish him a moralist. Part 5. The political ramifications of such a moral philosophy. Finally, Part 5 puts forward Kropotkin's cohesive steps towards his final analysis. There are 4 steps. Number 1. Moral progress is not being cultivated. This constitutes a critical analysis between the quality of our social life compared to our ancestors. Kropotkin makes an astute point that without such a comparison, we are left to believe that the decay or decadence of our current society is unavoidable or even desirable. The people, in terms of moral outlook, are floating between 2 extremes. On one hand, medieval superstition, and on the other hand, glorified amoralism. His critique seems to be only getting more affirmed as time goes on. In particular, he notes the misery caused by not cultivating moral instincts. Many of the psychological conditions, better realized in our days, may be explained by such a moral decay. Number 2. The current society restricts moral development. The active pursuit of self-interestedness, otherwise known as individualism, is not a bug or a glitch of the system, but instead a necessary consequence of both the development of capitalism and government. Such a critique should not be of great surprise considering Kropotkin is known as an anarchist communist. Number 3. The ignored historical significance of anarchist communism. What helps his previous critique of capitalism and government is his account of an alternative understanding of world history. It is a history which many, including myself, are not familiar with. It is not a history based on the conflict between different civilizations, but instead a conflict between a dichotomy, between the people and authority. Such a conflict is eventually snuffed out in an event that took place within the 3 cities of the medieval period. The complete destruction of all free agreements between men. Such an event has had far-reaching ramifications for how we live today. It also explains why what Kropotkin is advocating is so hard to accept today. Number 4. The political philosophy of anarchist communism is the only viable alternative. A society which recaptures its ability to engage in the development of moral progress, which requires the abolishment of both government and capitalism. Therefore, such a society would be categorized as both anarchist and communist in nature. Like every serious anarchist thinker, Kropotkin very much believes in a social revolution. That is, quote, "The masses will have to take upon themselves the task of rebuilding society, will have to take upon themselves the task of constructing upon communalistic basis without awaiting any orders and directions from above." To end with a quote from the Ethics, "To remodel life in such a way that a new page in the ethical life of mankind may be opened." That's the end of the introduction. The first part in this series is titled Mutual Aid, Kropotkin and Darwin. Thanks for listening.